Over time, Colum began to discern, in all the flowery talk and puzzling metaphors, an orderly system that reduced the chaos of combat to something almost comprehensible. In the art of the longsword, there were 14 guards, 5 major and 9 minor, no more, no fewer. There were 8 cuts, all linked by flowing motions and arcs that chained them together. There were 4 thrusts and 4 parries. All else arose from combinations of these fundamental elements. Colum's world was now sharply divided between the humiliating abuses of his life as a servant and his steady progress in the promised land of the training yard. It occurred to him early on to steal a real sword and kill Lord Alastair with it, but that seemed unnecessary now. He wasn't worth it. It would just be a distraction. As prodigies will, Colum outstripped first his peers, and then the motley gang of household knights who lodged at Dew Hall, who learned quickly that they wanted nothing to do with Alastair's terrifying feral fosterling. He spent a lot of time alone fighting the Pell, a thick-stripped pine post 6 feet tall that was a staple of knightly training. Akusan taught him an antique poem about it called, naturally enough, The Poem of the Pell, which began, "Of fight the discipline and exercise was this, to have a pale or pile upright of many's height. Thus rideth old wise. Therewith a bachelor or young knight shall first be taught to stand and learn fight." Hi, and thank you for clicking on my read and review of The Bright Sword by Lev Grossman. I was lucky enough to get this signed copy from my local bookstore, and I absolutely love the cover of this. I think it is just incredibly beautiful. This cover art, immaculate. Alright, so as for the non-spoiler, quick and easy version of the review, would I recommend it? 100% yes. I gave this book a strong 8 out of 10 stars. It was fun from start to finish. The author really does a good job at pulling you in, making all of the characters interesting and lovable. His backstories are masterfully written, and there wasn't a single character in this book I didn't care about. I felt like the author did a super good job giving me a reason to buy into every character, and every little flashback scene and every bit of storytelling that we're given just felt worth it. And it felt important to the plot. I couldn't recommend it enough. I think, especially if you're struggling to kind of get back into fantasy or get into fantasy period, I think this was a really easily digestible book with an easy to follow story, fun characters, and overall just a really enjoyable ride. So just to recap, I recommend it, 8 out of 10 stars, and this will be it for the non-spoiler portion. All right, jumping into the spoiler portion of the review now. A quick overview of things I liked. Number 1, the depth of emotion given to Colum in light of things like fighting and taking life. So, this was really interesting to me. I felt as if the author really did their due diligence in kind of delving into the psyche of someone who had just experienced their first battle, especially a young man like Colum, and what that feels like. That's something I can definitely relate to. Being an army veteran and kind of sympathizing with Colum, like, holy cow, those are very real feelings, and that's a super good way to portray this. It kind of makes me feel like maybe the author has family members who served or some sort of experience, secondhand or otherwise, with this subject, because the way Colum described the heat of battle, how he felt in it, and how it's just sort of this all-consuming feeling of invincibleness, and then contrast that later with how he feels so distraught and guilty, and just the contrast of those two things was so brutally real, and that really struck a chord with me. So bravo to the writer for either being able to just craft that feeling or doing the research on what experiencing that is like. Either way, super well crafted, and I just really appreciated that. Number 2, the depth of backstories given to all of the characters. So often in big chunky books like this, where you really get to experience a lot of backstory and there's a lot of characters and all of them are very detailed, I often find myself sort of weary because I just get tired, you know? I'm like, let's focus on the main character. Let's focus on the characters we care about. Let's focus on the characters that are fleshed out and lovable. And in this book, at first I was like, oh great, we have a bunch of flashback chapters. But admittedly, the author just did an absolutely fantastic job making me care about all the characters and making these flashback portions, introducing them, just so enjoyable. I often found myself being like, oh no, the flashback portions are ending and we're getting back to the main story. I was really engaged in the tale of Sir Scipio and Sir Dinadan. Wow, just some fantastic characters, and the art of making people care about a cast so large is crazy. I absolutely loved the stories told about the Knights of the Round Table in this, and admittedly at first I was reading the first few chapters and I was like, this is far too many characters. I feel like I'm reading Game of Thrones, you know? How am I supposed to remember who all of them are? How am I supposed to remember their names and what they look like? And fret not, because I think you're supposed to kind of feel that way at first. It's very overwhelming. You're meeting all of these Knights of the Round Table. You're like, who's who said what, who is this person again? And then as these background chapters start to roll in, you know all, what, 8 or 9 of these characters like the back of your hand. You're like, oh, of course I know. No, yeah, Palomides said that. I know Palomides. I know Dinadan. I know Scipio. I know Constantine. I know Daggett. I know Bedivere. And eventually this huge cast of very important characters, no one really felt like a side character in this. Everyone kind of felt like they had their time in the sun, with the exception being Colum, because we get his point of view the most. It's just so rare a fantasy book this large with this many characters really draws me in, and I know who everyone is, so that felt really awesome and really special. Number 3, the subtle tale of colonization and how it is portrayed in the battle of identity going on with Britain and as displayed in the war between fairies and God. So in this book, I feel like there's a lot of subtle themes, and I'm not sure if they're subtle. I think calling it a subtle theme is probably wrong. I think it's a very major theme, right? So as a person who has a background in sociology and a master's in social work, I can really appreciate the story of colonization and how it is reflected in people, culture, food. Nothing is untouched by it. Britain is a place where the Roman Empire truly left its mark in every thinkable way. We even have characters reflecting on that when they talk about fish sauce or apples. They can't even appreciate their native customs, their native food, their native culture, because they're so obsessed trying to live up to the standard that the Roman Empire left behind. And then you have the other half of Britain that's like, ooh, gross. I don't want anything to do with anything resembling the Roman Empire. I don't want to eat their food. I don't want to see their god. I don't want to hear their prayers. I don't want to hear their language. And it's just this super interesting battle between what Britain was and what Britain is becoming. And then at the end of the book, there's even more introduced to it. So now a country struggling with its identity post-colonization is having a flood of immigrants, being the Saxons, coming into their country and introducing their culture and their food and their gods. And so now you just have this amalgamation of cultures and foods and gods and feelings and people kind of trying to find their place in this world where its identity is lost. And that core theme of this book felt so well done and so special. I think trying to portray something as big as colonization and the impact it has on people and societies is a really tough thing to do. And if you didn't pay attention to it, I don't really think you would pick up on that. The author does it so well that if you weren't looking at this book through that lens, you would just be like, oh, these are people struggling after the Roman Empire left and their cultures are mixed. But if you really dig into it and kind of look at what the book is showing you, I think there's a deeper message there and a really fun, insightful look into colonization in a framework we're not used to looking at it through, you know? I mean, often in today's day and age, we kind of look at colonization as like a white issue, you know? White people came and colonized. Who were these people that colonized the world, being Great Britain, before, you know, before they themselves were colonized, before they themselves had their culture, their language, their food stripped away from them, you know? And I think it's just an interesting tale overall. Yeah, hopefully I didn't ramble on this too long. I think as a sociology undergrad and a social work post-grad, I think I just clinged on to this story a little bit more than maybe I should have, but I just thought it was portrayed so well, and you really get what you want to take from it. And if that's not something you, the reader, wants to buy into, you don't have to worry, because it's not like in your face and super obvious. It's just something I'm taking away from the book personally. Number 4, the dialogue is rich and not boring. So this is a note I took towards the end of the book. I feel like in a lot of dialogue heavy books where there's a lot of political intrigue and backdoor conversations happening, I often get bored of reading so much dialogue and so little action filling the pages in between, especially in fantasy books. Sci-fi, that's kind of a staple of the genre, but fantasy, I get bored of dialogue very easily, and the author, the conversation exchanges just kind of left me on the edge of my seat. I really wanted to know what the person was going to say next. It never felt boring. It never felt like a marathon of, and then Colum said, and then Nimue said, and then Bedivere said, and then Colum said. I hate that in a book. The author here, the conversations just seem to flow. And by the way people talk, you know who's talking. There's almost no need to say, and then Colum said, and then Nimue said, because you kind of just automatically know. And I just really enjoyed the lengthy dialogue exchanges, which is super rare for me. Number 5, the many fun plot twists that actually subvert expectations. In this book, I never even knew where we were going. So Colum obviously has this mission to be knighted, be a member of the Round Table, meet King Arthur, and sort of become the knight no one ever thought he could. And so originally you start the story thinking, okay, this is the story of Colum becoming Sir Colum of the Round Table, and then it's not. And you go, okay, so this is the quest to find Arthur. And then you're like, okay, so this person wants to be king, and this is what's going to happen. Oh, Colum's the son of Arthur. Oh, no, he's not. And there's so many just twists and turns, and you never know where the book is going to end. Yeah, and so all of the twists just felt meaningful. They subverted my expectations, and it was very fun. Number 6, I think, I sort of lost count. So, the author expertly creates a trans character that is easy to buy into for casual audiences who probably wouldn't be interested in a story like that otherwise, and the way it is related is immaculate. The same way Colum is a commoner who aspires to be a knight even though his low birth prohibits him from becoming one is directly relatable to Dinadin's aspirations of becoming a knight even though he was born a woman. This was a fantastic way to relate the trans experience to a casual male audience. So my thoughts on that, I think fantasy is a genre that is often dominated by a straight white male audience, and that just kind of goes back to its roots. It's no fault of its own. It's just kind of the demographic who started it and pushed it and who enjoy it. And I think we're starting to see a huge shift in that now, obviously. Fantasy is written for everyone, by everyone, and it's really cool to get new perspectives and new stories told by different demographics of people. And I think often a straight white male audience like myself have a hard time relating to these stories told through different perspectives because we're so used to traditional perspectives in stories. It makes it hard to buy into, even if it's no fault of your own and you have no biases towards these new stories through new perspectives. You're not the target audience, and it's not written for you. And more power to the authors who write those stories. So in essence, all I'm saying is it's hard to buy into these new stories as a straight white man who's so deeply rooted in traditional fantasy. And I think this author does a fantastic job relating the struggles and the story of a trans person in fantasy to a wide audience. And I think it's really well done the way he does it. It's easy to understand and easy to digest for the average male fantasy reader to be like, oh wow, as someone who doesn't really understand the trans experience and maybe who doesn't even want to hear about it, I can take something away from this and kind of be like, oh, okay, no, that totally makes sense. The same way Colum is born a commoner, but he aspires to be a knight, Dinadin was born a woman who aspires to be a knight. They both share the same struggle at its core. They just weren't born in a position to be knights. And I think being able to relate that sentiment to the traditional fantasy audience is great. And it's sort of told in a way that removes your bias for you, and it's easy to buy into and understand. And I think we need more stories that are able to do that, so that people coming from the demographic I am are able to sort of like buy into these stories and understand these characters, so that moving forward with the fantasy genre as it changes, we don't feel left behind and we're able to enjoy fantasy as it evolves. But overall, the way Dinadin's story was told was so expertly done, and I really enjoyed it. My seventh note, water. Oof. My throat is so dry. Number 7. As a very picky fantasy reader, I often shy away from stories surrounding Arthurian legend, and this was the first book to ever pull me into that world and mythos. I think as someone who grew up in Middle America and had absolutely no English influence, I didn't watch The Sword and the Stone growing up. I watched like the Monty Python's Holy Grail movie once. I didn't really have any understanding of Arthurian legend and mythology of Great Britain way back in the day, and I was just super adverse to those stories because I'm like, for whatever reason, Arthurian legend really never clicked with me as a fantasy reader, and I was just always like, I don't really want to read a Sword in the Stone story. The book, kind of funny enough, talks about like, most people think that the Sword in the Stone was Excalibur. Me? Yeah, I thought the Sword in the Stone was Excalibur, and I thought the Lady of the Lake was just some lady who talks to King Arthur at some point. I had no idea that the Sword and the Stone and Excalibur weren't the same thing, and the book riffs off that, and it's super funny. And I feel like I've walked away with this with a much better understanding of Arthurian legend, and I think if you're someone like me who has no idea what the Sword and the Stone is, who King Arthur was, I think this is an absolutely fantastic introduction to Arthurian legend. Another thing, I had absolutely no idea that Arthur was like a 6th century character, and that back then there were no suits of knight armor. Camelot wasn't even real yet. The Muslim religion, which is mentioned in this book, wasn't real yet. And Arthur was more of like a leather armor wearing Celt than he was a knight of Great Britain during its medieval height. And the author kind of mentions that at the end and talks about how everyone adds something to the story of King Arthur. They added Camelot, they added the Sword and the Stone, they added armor, they added Roman influence, and I think the author does a super good job adding their take on King Arthur and the Arthurian legend. So yeah, those are all the things I loved about the book. Getting into the things I didn't like. There was only one thing I didn't like, and sadly it was the ending. So admittedly, going into this book, it was going to be a 9 out of 10 for me the entire way through until like the last 3 chapters. The ending, and keep in mind this is subjective, right? These are just my complaints. If you think it's a 9 out of 10, I love that for you. I was a little disappointed by the ending. So admittedly, at the end, click away because this is the big reveal. If you haven't read the book but you watch the spoiler section, now's your time to stop. So at the end, the whole buildup of the book is like, who's going to be king now that Arthur's gone? Or is it going to be Arthur coming back from Avalon? Well, it's not. It ends up being Guinevere, King Arthur's now widowed wife. And I know I said the author did a super good job making me care about all the characters in depth. The only exception to that was Guinevere. We never get a Guinevere heavy POV where we're introduced to her and get her story. We do get a brief chapter where she interacts with Arthur in their like winter cabin during the time of the Holy Grail quest, but it's not really enough to make you care about Guinevere the same way you care about Palomides, Bedivere, and Scipio and Dinadin. And so at the end, she becomes High Queen of Britain, and she gets Excalibur, and it's a happily ever after ending. For me, it felt super disappointing because I had so much buy-in to the story of Colum and the story of Arthur and the story of Lancelot, and I feel like my expectations were subverted in the worst way. It's very reminiscent of the last season of Game of Thrones where you're like, okay, who's gonna be king? And they're like, it's Bran the Broken. And you're like, why? Okay, I guess. And that's just kind of how it felt when it was like, Colum declared Guinevere queen. in her instance. And I was just like, oh, wow, okay, darn. I really thought it was going to be one of the characters we bought into so heavily. And then the book kind of abruptly ends. You don't get to know what happens with Colum and Nimue after their blossoming romance. You don't get to know what happens to Bedivere. You don't really get to know what happens to Palomides and his newfound love in Morgan Le Fay. It's just like, Colum declares Guinevere king, and you're like, what? And then bam, it's over, and you get a brief excerpt about Sir Dinadan. Oh man, I mean, if that's your ending and you thought it was super well done and you loved that ending, please tell me why. Maybe there's something I missed. Maybe I'm wrong about something. And keep in mind, this is so heavily subjective. If I'm wrong, let me know. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I read something wrong, because this was going to be my first 9 out of 10 book, but the ending brought it down to an 8 out of 10 for me, which is still fantastic, because if you keep in mind, 5 for me is average, 6 is good, 7 is exceptional, 8 is really good, 9 is like an almost perfect book, and 10 is like an obtainable score that I'll probably never give out. So 8 is still just amazing, and I think the entirety of the book leading up to the end is still worth a 9 out of 10. It's just the ending that gets me. So please, by all means, let me know how you felt about it. I would love to talk with someone in the comments about it, but at the end of the day, I'm still recommending it. It's still one of my favorite fantasy books, and I think this was a fantastic introduction into Arthurian legend. And honestly, I'll probably be picking up copies of the author's other books, The Magicians. So at the end of the day, I loved it. But yeah, please, by any means, let me know how you felt about it.